Bath is a golden city, gracefully draped over the steep sides of a Cotswold valley carved out by the River Avon, travelling its course to the sea. As the sun rises and another day dawns, the story of Bath continues. Many tourists will come to visit the well-known sites, the Roman remains, the famous baths, and the hot springs giving Bath its status as a spa. The Romans certainly made their mark here, but the elegant Georgian buildings which dominate present-day Bath belong to an extraordinary period of history. The connections between Bath and Jane Austen range from the purely coincidental to the extremely tangible. Coincidentally, Jane was born in the year that Bath's world-famous Royal Crescent was completed. Far more tangible is the fact that Jane's great-great-uncle, the Duke of Chandos, who visited Bath when it was still a rather cramped, squalid city in the early 1720s, saw it had potential. The Duke hired a young, ambitious architect called John Wood to redesign St. John's Hospital for him. This was John Wood's first step to a complete recreation of Bath. He was a visionary who overcame the difficulties of speculative building and, with the help of his son John Wood the Younger, fulfilled his ambition, in his own words, building a new Rome, achieving design in harmony with genteel function. When Jane Austen moved to Bath in 1801, she certainly failed to appreciate John Wood's noble intentions. On her arrival in the May of that year, she described Bath as being
all vapour, shadow, smoke and confusion.
Neither did the city improve for her on further acquaintance. However, for anyone wishing to study the society that Jane Austen lived in, Bath stands as a testament to every facet of life in her day. It was here in Bath that Richard Beau Nash laid down manners and etiquette for a more civilised code of behaviour which would sweep the nation. As a result, the city was home to many distinguished people of the day. The young Nelson lived in Pierpont Street, Oliver Goldsmith in North Parade, Josiah Wedgwood lived in Gay Street, and Samuel Wilberforce, famous for the abolition of slavery, lived at Great Pulteney Street. Sheridan lived in the Royal Crescent, and anyone who was anyone visited the city. Dr. Johnson, Alexander Pope, Wordsworth, Gainsborough, Mary Wollstonecraft, and Sir Walter Scott, to name but a few. Every one of these people represent aspects of Jane Austen's society. They were the thinkers of the day, whether artists, writers, architects, scientists, theologians, soldiers or politicians. Jane Austen herself did much to capture the essence of the period in her novels. She was also a prolific letter writer, particularly in her correspondence with her older sister Cassandra, and it is these letters that have helped us to a better understanding of life at the turn of the 18th and 19th century. Today's Bath, busy with people going about their business, independently declining the entreaties from cafes and restaurants to take morning coffee or afternoon tea, preferring to eat whatever they choose whenever they feel hungry. It's hard to imagine what Jane Austen would make of the sheer variety of food available, and if she glanced at the newspaper stands, she would definitely be in for a shock. The salacious nature of the tabloid stories may fail to interest these people rushing from place to place, but for Jane, the fact that a vast amount of the subject matter relates to the present-day royal family would have been beyond belief. As a young woman, Jane would have been aware of the satirical cartoons drawn by James Gilray, which did little to flatter George III and his family. No matter how amusing these may have been, the activities of the royal family still had a great influence on people's everyday lives, and could provide a real cause for concern. For this reason, the royal family is an appropriate aspect of Jane Austen's society to begin with. George III had been king for 15 years when Jane Austen was born on the 16th of December 1775. He was the first Hanoverian monarch to be born in England, the son of Frederick, Prince of Wales. Prince Frederick died in 1751, which was no doubt a relief to his father, King George II, who would have been much happier about being succeeded by his grandson George III. Frederick's parents both absolutely loathed him. In fact, his mother, Queen Caroline, was said to have been comforted on her deathbed by the thought that she would never see that monster again. Early in his reign, George III developed an interest in the study of agriculture, earning himself the nickname of Farmer George. This may explain why Jane Austen was so familiar with the concept of the gentleman farmer, which he uses so evocatively in her novel Emma. George III married Princess Charlotte in 1761, when she was just 18 years old. They met at St. James's Palace 6 hours before their wedding. It was a successful marriage, producing 15 children, with the king remaining completely faithful to his queen. He was a well-respected monarch, and when he became ill in 1788, there was genuine concern for his well-being throughout the country. The nature of his condition, progressively worsening mental derangement, was a mystery to his doctors, who made his life a misery with barbaric treatments, including the use of a straitjacket. Medical science has since diagnosed him as suffering from porphyria, a hereditary physical illness with symptoms including delirium and delusions, giving every impression of madness. This letter, written by Jane from her home in Chawton in 1811, after the king had been particularly ill, shows just how great an impact royal events could have upon the lives of ordinary people.
I had just left off writing and put on my things for walking to Alton, when Anna and her friend Harriet called in on their way thither, so we went together. Their business was to provide mourning against the king's death, and my mother has had bombazine bought for her. I'm not sorry to be back again, for the young ladies had a great deal to do, and without much method in doing it.
Mrs. Austen was altogether more enthusiastic about the matter than her daughter. She had shrewdly worked out that
black funereal bombazine would be cheaper now than when the poor king is actually dead.
Always known for her practical if not tactful nature, Mrs. Austen went on to comment,
"If I outlive him, it will answer my purpose, and if I do not, somebody may mourn for me in it. It will be wanted for one or the other, I dare say, before the moths have eaten it up."
The king surprised everyone, living on to the age of 81, eventually dying in 1820, surviving 3 years longer than Jane Austen herself, as she died in July of 1817. The relapse he suffered in 1810, however, did effectively end any power to rule for George III. In 1811, the Regency Act was passed, and the Prince of Wales, the future George IV, took charge. One problem common to the Hanoverian kings seems to have been their inability to get on with their sons. As we've already heard, George III's father, Frederick, was hated by his father, George II, and George III developed a dislike for his son, George IV, while he was still a boy. George III suffered great disappointment over the behaviour of all of his sons. Each of them got into debt, married or lived with unsuitable women, and produced illegitimate children. After 40 years on the throne, George III, father of 15 children, could only claim one legitimate grandchild. For a man of high personal standards, whose views were sympathetic to a natural moral order, this was a tragedy. The Austen family shared the widely held view that the first duty of government was to preserve order, and this was just about maintained during the reign of George III, but with the birth of the Regency, a wind of change would blow through every level of society. Jane Austen's novels were all published during the Regency period, and some of the more outrageous behaviour of the prince may have made Jane take a stronger moral stand in her novels. This letter, which Jane wrote from Steventon in 1798, proves that she had kept an eye on the prince's affairs long before he became regent.
I have changed my mind and changed the trimmings of my cap this morning. They are now such as you suggested. I felt as if I should not prosper if I strayed from your directions, and I think it makes me look more like Lady Conyngham now than it did before, which is all that one lives for now.
Lady Conyngham was one of the prince's influential mistresses. There were a succession of mistresses throughout his life. He even entered into a marriage ceremony with twice-widowed Catholic Mrs. Maria Fitzherbert. The prince was only 23 and Mrs. Fitzherbert 28. He certainly seemed to prefer older, more experienced women, and as Maria refused to be his mistress, he married her. The marriage was kept secret, because the bride's Catholic faith made it invalid. One image that Jane Austen uses quite strikingly in her novels is that of immoral deeds leading to financial ruin. Was this based on Prince George? In 1795 his debts amounted to a quite staggering £630,000, and the only way out of it was to marry a German princess of his father's choosing. The marriage to his cousin Caroline of Brunswick was a disaster, and within months the couple had parted in a very public and acrimonious manner, but George's debts had been settled by Parliament. It was his treatment of his wife that perhaps upset Jane Austen the most. Jane didn't live long enough to see George IV become king, but she would have seen it as appropriate that he lost much of his popularity when he had the would-be Queen Caroline excluded from his coronation. Caroline died only a few weeks later, and the couple's only daughter, and George III's only legitimate grandchild, Princess Charlotte, died in childbirth. There was a more cultured side to the Prince Regent, and he did much to further public interest in the arts. He was also a great patron of architecture, the Regent's Park area of London being an example of his taste. The Prince employed the skills of architect John Nash to design and build these gracious houses. Unlike the houses that John Wood built in Bath, which applied the classical principles throughout, these are glorious facades, with surprisingly plain interiors. John Nash was also the architect responsible for the urban planning, which divided London into east and west. He laid out Trafalgar Square, built the elegant columns of the Mall, and used the stylish curves of Regent Street to split the desirable residents of the West from the poverty and squalor of Soho and the East. The most famous London landmark of today, Buckingham Palace, received the Nash treatment as well. George III had bought Buckingham House for the grand sum of £28,000 in 1762, with a view to replacing the dust trap of St James's Palace. However, it was George IV who commissioned Nash to redesign the house after his father's death in 1820. Rumour has it that George IV was rather partial to the wife of John Nash, which perhaps explains why it took until 1837 to complete.